Hey everyone, welcome to Economics of Queerness, which is the hottest event of maybe the whole year. I don't know, just a claim. It's so nice to have all of you here, and thank you for showing up as well. And so just to start, I'm going to welcome all of you as well, and also welcome, we're Decolonising Economics, and we're a grassroots collective working to build an economy built on racial justice principles. And we are doing, this is our last one actually, of our Decolonising Futures program, which is helping us to raise funds for a cooperative, a cooperative learning program that me and Guppi have been working on for a couple of years. And just to introduce Decolonising Economics, it's me, Noni, Guppi, do you want to give a little wave? Sophie, who's in there somewhere, who can also give a wave, and Ola. And so today, Ola will be helping you with all your tech things. So if you have any tech problems, you can't, I don't know, your sound isn't working or whatever, Ola's the person to talk to. And also today, we're joined by like a long-time collaborator and friend of Decolonising Economics, June, who's also there somewhere, who'll give you a wave. And yeah, and I'm just going to pass over to Sophie, who will tell you a bit about like the logistics of the call around like captioning as well. Okay, we have live captioning software. Apparently it's an AI, it's a robot that does the captioning for us. And I think in the chat, you should see Sophie posted something about, Sophie posted something about how to have access to the transcript of the event. I think we'll repost it again so you can see. And so I'm also going to pass on to June, who's our co-host for today, to kind of introduce themselves. June, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hey everyone, thank you for coming. Thank you for being here. Yeah, my name's June. I am an event producer, community organizer, and writer based in London. And yeah, when I found out about like the Decolonising Economics new launch, me and Noni had a few conversations about doing an event centered on queerness and transness and economics of queerness and transness. And this is how this event came to be.
Exciting. And we're also joined today by Amardeep Singh Dhillon, who is a program and content coordinator at The World Transformed, an editor at Red Pepper magazine and freelance journalist, and a bartender and trade union organizer with South London Bartenders Network. He likes long walks on the beach, Troy Sivan, and the abolition of the nuclear family. We love all of those things. That's such a great bio. And we're also joined by Evan, Evan Ifekoya, who is an artist and energy worker whose practice often starts with the question, what would it mean to start from a place of abundance? Great question. They consider art as a site where resources can be both redistributed and renegotiated, whilst challenging the implicit rules and hierarchies of public, but basically there's a slide with the pictures of all the speakers. But anyway, sorry. Evan considers art as a site where resources can be both redistributed and renegotiated whilst challenging the implicit rules and hierarchies of public and social space. They have presented exhibitions, moving image, and performances across the UK, Europe, and internationally, most recently at FACT, the Liverpool Biennale, with Boss 2021, Gus Fisher New Zealand, the Apple Netherlands, and the Black Unicorn Cooperative Fund and Collective Creativity. So basically, we've got really exciting speakers. And just to kind of give you a bit of why we decided to do the event. Okay, so just to tell you a bit about why we decided to do the event, we are trying to raise money for our cooperative learning program and also trying to tell people about the Just Transition framework, which is a framework that we use, a strategy framework we use a lot at Decolonising Economics. And the Just Transition framework explains the current economy, which is described as an extractive economy, which runs on the consumerist mindset and is based on like extraction and digging and burning and dumping and exploiting people, and is policed through militarism. And its whole purpose is to enclose power and wealth for a select few, which sucks. And we're interested in building the living economy. And the living economy is one that makes people happy and gives people life. And in the living economy, the economy is based on like regeneration and deep democracy and caring and sacredness. And the purpose of the economy is to, for ecological and social well-being. And it's kind of exists to support cooperation, which is something that we love. And so when we're thinking of this event, because we've done other events on racial hierarchies, on reparations, on disability justice, of thinking about what if the economy was built from the people who are exploited and marginalized by the current design of the economy, and especially with queerness and the ways in which the gender binary exists to kind of uphold wealth and power for a select few. We're trying to have these conversations to kind of rethink of how those, like how the current economy exists to kind of continue to marginalize and how we could make it different. And so why did we decide to do the event? One of the things that personally I was really interested in is how queerness has been used across history to deny like rights and like not even rights, just like life, right? I'm really interested in this theory of like necropolitics, which describes the way in which state power exists to kill specific people. And that's how the world was built, through the murder of Black, queer, and disabled people. And so when I was thinking of this event with June, we were thinking about the ways in which queer people across history have been denied life across so many different ways, and about also the material lives of queer people, the ways in which we experience like not having the basic necessities to live, like such as housing or health or like care. And also the ways in which homophobia has been used to kind of deny like countries in the global south like aid or like reparations as well, because, you know, if they're homophobic, then they're bad. But then also the idea that homophobia is actually a Western construct that has been used by the colonial powers to continue relationships of domination. So that's some of the things that I was thinking about when me and June were setting up the event. What about you, June?
Yeah, I mean, I think like similarly to you, I feel like necropolitics is like a major driving force into like thinking about this. And I think we see it very obviously in the UK with the state of trans healthcare. I think trans people are, being like actively, you know, murdered by a state. At the moment, if any trans person was to like be referred to a gender identity clinic to start hormones, the waiting time is 3 to 5 years, which is, you know, like absolutely wild to ask people to live under those conditions for that amount of time. And then I think if you connect it to like also an economic point of view, obviously the NHS is meant to be like free healthcare, but it obviously isn't for trans people because of this waiting time. And all trans services are also run by like cis straight people. So even if anyone does decide to go the private route, they're basically putting money into like cis straight people who are enriching themselves out of our struggles and out of our pain. And that, so that just made me like really angry. So I guess that's why I'm, you know, I was keen to do something where we can talk about this and challenge this. And I think on a very, you know, personal level, I know when we talk about like, you know, trans healthcare crisis, I think it can feel very distant, but like on a very personal level, in 1 year, 3 trans people that I know took their own life, and they were all in positions of financial scarcity, and they were all, and I feel like their death is inextricably linked to their transness. So yeah, I think like that was like a really big driving force. And then if you obviously think about things like intersectionality, then obviously race and like migrant rights come into play as well. And with the kind of like heavy bureaucracy that's involved with transness and trans healthcare, anyone who is an asylum seeker or a migrant will have an even harder time to access any of these services. And then from a colonial point of view, like something that I'm really interested in is Indigenous Southeast Asian trans identities. And as you said, homophobia is like a colonial export. and we see it across the colonies that may have laws that criminalize homosexuality that weren't present before colonialism. And from my own heritage, there's a figure in Myanmar called Nagados, who are trans feminine spirit mediums, and they used to be venerated, and they used to, possess like abundance and wealth and these things that we're talking about. And since colonialism, their living conditions have like decreased drastically. And yeah, so I think the threat of white supremacy and capitalism on queerness is like so real, and it can be seen obviously in the UK, and it can be seen globally. Yeah, it's like I feel like I just spoke for age, but yeah, that's why I wanted to do the event.
Thanks, June. That was like such a great primer of all the things that we're going to talk about today. And I kind of figured out the slides as well. So, and I wanted to like read this quote that our friend Nim, who's a trans rights climate justice organizer, wrote, and it's really great. And it says, there are real parallels in the ways that humans extract from the planet and create borders and police populations in service of profit, and the ways that humans extract what they need from the bodies of people and create borders between our bodies and control us in service of profit. Many of the ways we understand and categorize people in the modern world were constructed explicitly by Northern Europe in order to justify their project of global dominance and wealth accumulation, colonialism, via industrial capitalism in the 19th century. They needed a workforce to deliver that expansion and extraction from the planet, and there were certain types of bodies that were deemed useful or not useful in that conquest. The colonizers assigned value to different human life to morally justify themselves, to morally justify to themselves the degradation and dehumanization of different people in the pursuit of personal wealth. A key function of that dehumanization was to reduce people to bodies, and to reduce bodies to a vessel of labor, a tool of production. Black bodies were enslaved to provide free and forced labor to expand the extraction of resources. For Europe, while disabled people were deemed unfit as they couldn't produce labor needed in an industrial workforce, LGBTQ plus people were deemed immoral because we weren't able to reproduce for the workforce that was needed for industrial expansion. I love that quote because it's just like everything is on purpose and it was designed to be operate in that way. And so, shall we get into it and hear from our great speakers? I'm going to pass over to June, who will do the questions.
Thank you, Nani. Yeah, I think we wanted to start off. Maybe obviously we gave a quick bio, but Evan, if maybe you wanted to expand a bit on your work and what you do and how you feel it connects to the theme of today's event.
Yeah, okay. Well, hi everyone, and thank you for the invitation. So, yeah, I mean, I was a little bit, I mean, was I surprised? Maybe I was a little bit surprised to be invited because, fundamentally and primarily I am an artist. That is how I express and share things, with the world is through art. But, over the last 12 or so years, at the forefront of the way that I make art has been, how can that be something that happens in dialogue and in collaboration with other people? And, it's usually with my communities, be that, queer people of color, Black folk, and kind of various kind of intersecting vectors around that, and then also as Nani mentioned, it's also like how within the context of art can we think about how and where resources can be accessed and also renegotiated. So even though I am very much an artist, like object making is not really at the forefront. It's very much around like building relationships, developing relationships, and kind of thinking about like how can we bring and take things to where they're needed. And so, yeah, I've been part of a number of different collectives over the years. Collective creativity since 2012 has been a place where, I've organized with other, queer, Black and people of color artists around just sort of really readdressing the imbalances actually within our own arts education. And so we did a lot of work sort of trying to remap and kind of reconfigure ourselves within the canon. And some really amazing people who I'm sure you'll be familiar with are part of that group, like Rudy Lowe, Raju Singh, Rai Kabir, and some other folks who have also been involved over the years. And it's involved doing work with people who are at art school, but also in informal settings. And we've developed resources and workshops and things as part of that. So there's that aspect. But then I also do like exhibitions and shows. And a show in 2018 led to Black Obsidian Sound System coming into existence. It was a moment where, because often when I'm doing exhibitions, I'm thinking, okay, there's going to be this thing that's happening, but how can it also be a way that there can be, it can sort of have a benefit within the context of the exhibition, but they can also have a life outside of the exhibition. And I'd been really influenced by a lot of the Black women artists from the 80s, like Labeina Hamid and Maud Salter, Claudette Johnson, who did a lot of self-organizing. It was very much about not waiting until institutions and galleries or whatever took notice of them, but really took things into their own hands. And that meant, just finding resources however they could and sharing them, So I think that's something that I really kind of absorbed, within my own kind of journey as an artist. And then BOSS, Black Obsidian Sound System came as a result of getting funding to make this show and kind of making the decision that actually because I work in sound a lot, and was just what, actually this is a moment where something like this could really be of benefit to the communities that I'm part of. And some folks might be familiar with our work now. And and I think what I'm also really invested in is projects where they can really take on a life of their own, and they can be shaped and developed by the people who are involved. So even though I'm often part of the beginning and the genesis of projects coming to be, for me, it's very important that there's a kind of non-hierarchical approach to working and navigating whatever the various projects are. And then another project that feels important to mention here is Black Unicorn Co-op Fund, which was formerly the UK QTBPOC Hardship Fund, which I think there's people in the room who are also involved in BOSS. It is very much a project around, how do we, as queer people of color, how do we, especially in this time, it's a wealth redistribution project, essentially, kind of how do we kind of contribute to a process of resources going to and being accessed by the people that need them, and something that I'm also really invested in as well within my, again, because there's many different threads to my practice, is also having really frank conversations with people about our relationship to wealth, our relationship to scarcity, our relationship to abundance. And for me, I really see it fundamentally as also a spiritual concern. So it's something that because I think we live in this capitalist system that reduces us to, and has historically reduced us to, our materiality, to our flesh, and so part of my reason for being, and my purpose, I realize, is also to think about the work we need to do on a spiritual level, on a multidimensional level, because also our relationship to money, to wealth, is also a spiritual issue, so something I'm often thinking about is really asking questions around, like, what would it look like to consider myself an investment? What does it feel like, and actually kind of really starting with, like, what that feels like in the body, and then from there you can kind of build forward. And so that's kind of something I do in terms of, like, the spaces that I hold, in terms of workshops that I do, and also just in my own kind of individual practice, in terms of how I navigate my relationship to resources, but then I'm also in a position now where I can see what the benefits of that work have been, and that's why I'm really keen to extend that outwards. So yeah, maybe I'll stop there for now. Okay.
Thank you so much. I think, I feel like so much of what you said, rings a bell. And I think what you said around, like, your art practice and the way you work around that is so similar to the just transition framework that Noni just explained. And I think these things can be applied to economics, they can be applied to, our art practices, to realistically, like, anything we do in life and any way that we deal with community. And it should come from, like, a place of, like, solidarity and redistribution. And so I think like, something I'm really excited about, all of us speaking about this, is also the fact that none of us is, like, an economist or, like, a financial person. And, like, I don't really know what economy even means. And then I'm here running this event. So it's like, I think that's what's exciting, like, taking this, interpreting this idea of money and economy and applying it to us and, I don't know, the way we live. Thank you so much for sharing that. Amardeep, I'm going to ask you the same question. So if you could just expand a bit about your work and how you think it relates to economic justice and queerness.
Yeah, sure. And thank you, Evan. That was amazing and really interesting, and sparked so many different thoughts from my own experiences. I suppose the work that I do has primarily been quite specifically within, like, on the one hand, queer spaces, and on the other hand, dealing with kind of the front lines of what we mean by the economy. So I was kind of brought into organizing, I suppose, through Lesbians and Gay Support the Migrants, which was also an integral part of politicizing me, and also a space of care and a space of support and a process of community construction, not being from the city and kind of coming into my queerness, I suppose. And that space of organizing in a way that necessarily involves resource distribution in the form of time that volunteers and activists give, but also in the hard fact that it is material resources that enable you to run certain campaigns, that enable you to provide, material mutual aid or support to people who are going through the asylum process, for example. You can't get away from, the fact that the economy is not a concept for professors somewhere to grasp. It's something that violently impacts our lives. And so at the same time as engaging with that through LGS migrants, to experience a space of care and community was really, really equally important as a process of politicization. And I guess the other side to that is that I've been working in hospitality as a bartender for about 5 years now. And a couple of years ago, the pub that I work at unionized and took wildcat strike action because a couple of our staff had been dismissed because we were on 0 hours contracts. And from there, I kind of got catapulted into the world of, like, trade union organizing, often within the co-op and community sector, often within social enterprises, but often within more traditional kind of extractive businesses as well. And that sort of led to an acknowledgement that the kind of service provision method that many trade unions take in terms of we provide insurance, you pay your dues, was not working in hospitality, because hospitality has tiny sites. It has so many different ways of organizing the business and atomizing workers. It has so many different conditions, and it affects so many of us differently, given our relative positions within capitalism, right? Whether we're migrants, whether we're working class, whether we're queer or trans, or, you know, legibly so to different degrees. The different structural and workplace discriminations that we're exposed to has an effect on our ability to survive, right? And so it became clear to me and to some others that we couldn't rely on the traditional model of just telling people to join a union. We on the left, we love telling people to join a union. It's actually not always the efficacious thing to do. I'm sorry, honeys, but it's not enough to join a union. What you have to do is you have to work within and against your union to construct communities, because at the end of the day, it's not that one person can fight and win a victory in their workplace. It's one person with a system of care and support around them, ideally one person with a community, one person with 100 people behind them that can affect that change collectively. So off the back of that kind of ethos, some of us set up South London Bartenders Network last year. It's just a collective of hospitality workers, baristas, and we just started helping each other and talking to each other and providing emotional and material support, trade union training, education, and gradually it's grown into something that's been very powerful, and I think has kind of brought something new into the organizing space in hospitality. And that's precisely because it's centered on community. And I think that kind of, the reason that relates, I suppose, to queerness is that if we go back to, and if I'm ranting here, do tell me, by the way. I'm not sure if there's a structure that I'm riding roughshod over here. But we can queer the structure of this, I suppose. For me, when we're talking about queer liberation and economic justice, like in the quote that was just mentioned, I find it useful to go back to John D'Amelio, who's a theorist from the 80s, I believe. And John D'Amelio basically articulates this idea that the kind of modern identity of a gay person or a homosexual, and he was speaking, I think, specifically within that relatively narrow framework at the time, right? That was a product of what was a precursor to colonization in many ways, which was the enclosure of the commons in England. So it's where public land starts to disappear and it becomes privatized. There's mass urbanization as industry picks up and the Industrial Revolution gets going. This means communities get kind of broken up and people get atomized to like wage laborers. And in that context, where you are defined by what you do, no longer by the kind of collective around you, that in some ways provides the space for you to identify with things that are concomitantly being pathologized by the medical profession in the Western world. And so that's kind of what leads to, in a way, the articulation of kind of what was called gay liberation at that point as a political project, right? It comes from at root, and it might sound a bit uncomfortable, but it comes at root from the actual kind of constitution of the individual subject citizen within a Western state. From that, because of being outcast and oppressed, communities emerge, because we know that, you know, mutual aid has become a very popular buzzword following COVID, but we know that working class communities, queer communities, trans communities have always relied on mutual aid to survive capitalism, right? This is not a new thing that like lots of us have done with very good intentions, with lots of furloughed middle class, generally women, because care work is still feminized. But you know, the reason that mutual aid groups often didn't reach people of color is because people of color were doing mutual aid. They just didn't call it mutual aid. But I digress. I'll try and quickly get through this bit. So I think we have to acknowledge that if the gay liberation movement of the 80s came from the construction of communities, from the kind of construction of the individual subject within Western philosophy and Western institutions during the Enlightenment, what queer liberation means now to us also has to relate to or engage with the systems of capitalism that have developed from that, right? And so I think this is the sense in which when we talk about economic justice and queer liberation, whether that's through trade union organizing, whether it's through material redistribution, whether it's through mutual aid, we have to recognize that that's because actually queer liberation, in order to actually be achieved or realized, is predicated on like the destruction of the capitalist systems and its concomitant institutions of borders, police, carceral systems of surveillance. So queer liberation and economic justice, to sum up, I suppose, are inherently linked because it is this economic system that ensures, on the one hand, our oppression, but on the other hand, invites us to buy into it. In the sense that we can be turned against queer asylum seekers, we can be turned against queer sex workers, we can be turned against trans people. And so in that sense, queer liberation and economic justice are to a degree almost one and the same thing, with the caveat being that real economic justice means looking at what Evan was talking about in terms of spiritual and community and collective fulfillment. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That was, yeah, amazing. And I felt like everyone, yeah, I get in so much from what you just shared, and I feel like everyone did, and everything ranks so true. And I think it's so good that you kind of brought in like the historical element of it. I think that's like really useful to know, and something that like I feel like is also purposefully kind of like kept hidden. You know, it's like it's convenient for us not to know this information. It's convenient for us not to have this knowledge. So I think the more we are able to share this knowledge, the more, you know, liberation can actually happen. So thank you so much for everything that you shared. And I think the next thing that we're going to move on to, I think you both already touched upon, but if we specifically look at like what can we do to, you know, shift resources and power into queer people's hands, because as we said, these have been like removed from us under capitalism and the, you know, the economic system that we're under. So I think it would be good to know from both of your perspective what can we do to bring power back in our hands. Evan, do you want to go first?
Whew, yeah. I mean, that is a big but very, very important question. I mean, and you know, the way I'll answer it is very much in terms of like, you know, from my position, you know, in this moment. So I'll answer it like, what am I doing? And, you know, I think firstly, you know, fundamentally, kind of as I mentioned before, you know, I've had to really look at my own relationship to money, to scarcity, you know, in terms of my childhood, my upbringing, and then what I've kind of carried, you know, the trauma that I've inherited in relation to that. And so, you know, in terms of the spiritual dimension that I mentioned, you know, really trying to be on a path to healing, you know, and it is ongoing. You know, it's not that it ends here and that's it, I'm done and it's fixed, but, you know, really make it an ongoing discussion with myself and, you know, hopefully with others in my community. So just really kind of opening up really honest, frank conversations about our relationship to wealth, but in a way that of course is supported and held, because these are very hard and, you know, sometimes very traumatizing, you know, conversations to have. And then, you know, for me, you know, in this moment and where I am today is not where I've always been, but, you know, I'm in a place where, you know, I do get access to resources at times. So then my question to myself is, what do I do with those resources when I have them? You know, and that's where the question around like challenging and questioning the scarcity mindset comes in, you know, because it's like, do I approach it like, okay, I have this now, but then it'll, you know, then it'll be gone. So then I, you know, then I like close down. And then that's where the thing around like how we're encouraged to really individualize ourselves, you know, whereas I've kind of, I'm learning, and so I'm learning that, you know, in the body first and foremost, that actually it's, you know, it is okay to share. Like what is here will always come back, you know, and that you know, I think about, you know, this idea of abundance that I mentioned. You know, I think about it as, you know, a cup that can be replenished, and the way that it's replenished is not just financial, you know, and so that's why I kind of talk about this idea of you know, resources, and kind of how do I kind of be part of a process where resources are redistributed, because that, what that looks like is not always about money, but it's like, how do I create and be part of a system where resources are moving in and through my communities, and being intentional about the part that I can play in that. So, you know, like I mentioned with you know, with exhibition making, like just ensuring that, like, you know, if I have access to a budget, you know, how can I make sure that this does extend beyond just this moment? Like, how do I ensure that something about what I have access to in this moment can reach my communities and can be of benefit to my communities, you know? And then how do I also ensure that in me resourcing myself, I can also be of benefit to my communities? No, maybe I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah,
'Cause I
so
don't-
much wisdom. So, yeah, and if you feel like adding anything, that'll be fab. I think like what you shared is already abundant. So thank you for sharing that. Yeah, and actually, I feel like I find it personally like really frustrating, the separation of like spiritual and material. And I think like what you said, yeah, like really strikes a chord. And I feel like you can also see it just in, you know, any, you know, ritual or blessings or, you know, anything of that shape is somehow related to our material world. There's something around like donation, and, you know, in Buddhist practices, like donation is like a massive thing, and whether that's like food or money or, you know, any other resource, as you said, and like, and it will come back to you in both like materials and spiritual ways. So I love this idea of thinking about economics and, you know, resources under both of these elements, because that's how it is. So yeah, thank you for bringing that into the table. Yeah, Amardeep, and same question for you.
Yeah, I am. I found that really, again, really stimulating in lots of ways. And especially putting out that idea of the kind of the spiritual element of things, just because, you know, spirituality, it is expressed materially, right? And as an example, so I'm Sikh. I grew up in a Sikh community in the UK, and in Sikhi, there's a concept of seva, which is sort of selfless service, which is considered almost a form of worship, but definitely a kind of practice to be encouraged. And as part of that, there's langar, which is food, free food provision that is blessed within every gurdwara, which is every Sikh temple. And the point of that, I think it's quite interesting because it provides an interesting perspective from which to look at some of the mutual aid efforts that have happened over COVID. Because the idea of langar is not that it's just free food for people who want it. The reason that the langar is part of the worship space is that it's meant to be inviting that community construction, right? It's not just that you come and get free food if you're struggling, although you also can and should do that. It's that by doing so, you engage in a community that you can call your own. And that's very much tied to the worship and to the spirituality as well. Not in a prescriptive way necessarily, I'd argue. I've been in the langar hall and had conversations with people about doubts and about contradictions. And I think that kind of negotiation is very much part of it too. And so I think when we think about what's needed to kind of shift resources and power towards queer people, I think the first question that jumps out at me would be like, which queer people, right? South Asians have recently gone through the horror of having more representation than ever in government. Never a good thing. And you know, like when that is that shifting power to people of color, you know, and resources. Well, yeah, it is. It's not desirable. But I think when we talk about shifting power towards queer people, we're assuming a community or a collective, right? And I think it's really important to stress that our line of thinking is quite divorced from the way that identity politics has been bastardized and neoliberalized, right? by state mechanisms and by representation politics. We're talking about collective well-being. So in that sense, what's needed to shift resources and power is, on the one hand, the kind of work that you guys are doing, a non-extractivist economy, a cooperative economy, one that involves participatory democracy in the workplace, but also in the community. That's one thing that's needed. The other thing, though, I suppose, is that we need to think about who we're building coalitions with. So I mentioned earlier that I was involved with Lesbians and Gay Support the Migrants. That organization builds on Lesbians and Gay Support the Miners from the 80s, which was, a solidarity movement. And those forms of solidarity are really key given the challenges that we're facing ahead. I've read some books and stuff recently that suggests that like the Conservative Party is losing its voter base. They're kind of getting old and dying, RIP. And maybe we can hope now that there's going to be a progressive, welcoming generation that's coming through, right? And I think there is a bit of a danger sometimes, when we do look around and see the incredible, in some senses, in some cases, for some people, the incredible changes that have happened to a degree, right? And seems to, in some ways, have happened in representational terms in such a short amount of time. It can be tempting to be like, things are getting better. And I don't want to tell you they're not. I also do want to tell you, right, that within like the current like globalized capitalist system, given climate change, there's going to be, I think 1 million migrants to Europe by 2100 every year, right? In that context, in a capitalist extractivist economy, borders are going to harden and the working class is going to get shafted. People are going to get more precarious across the board. There is going to be less. In the lead up to that, as well as kind of fighting and subverting the border systems, as well as encouraging and caring for each other when we transgress them, we also need to start putting the work in of forming infrastructure of care and support. And I think the stuff that like Evan was talking about is so important, right? Because like, it's really clear to me on the left that like, I look around and I see who is doing care work here. And it is women and non-binary people and trans people and queer people. Those are the people doing care work because it's still seen as so feminized. But that kind of drive on the left often towards what we might call the politics of spectacle, right? Towards the marches, towards the rallies, towards sometimes the occupations, all of it necessary, but the focus on that to the expense of anything else has meant that often when we're exposed to the violences of the state and the far right, there's not always a community to hold us and care for us and protect us after the fact. There isn't an infrastructure that brings people in, that politicizes them, that says to them, care is political, care is spiritual, care is material and emotional, and it is part of a political project that we pursue as a queer community. And you get them in pockets, and actually maybe in the queer community, it's more prevalent. But more broadly, I think what we can do to build towards queer liberation is kind of engage in coalitions with other people, as we do every day, in building up our communities. Now, that can take the form of food co-ops that encourage kind of solidarity over a charity framework. It can take the form of making sure that we're setting up like chapters or joining Kill the Bill organizations. It means showing up to stop evictions. It means showing up to protest outside landlords. It means organizing in the workplace. And it means a whole host of these things all at once. And it's sort of terrifying, right? And I suppose that that's why probably the first and the most important thing is to make sure that we have those spiritual spaces and those caring spaces that will facilitate sustained disobedience as this island descends into climate breakdown proto-fascism.
Thank you. Yeah, and I feel like it's so easy when you think of things like this, like, oh, what can we do to bring power back, and what can we do for our conditions to improve, to kind of focus on that, like, heavily politicized element, which is necessary, and this idea of rebellion, and we need to do these things, but it's so important to also think about like our healing, and I think that's also a major aspect of us to be able to do this work and to be able to hold this power and to be able to challenge this system that is actively trying to kill us. We also need to like heal from it somehow, and like doing that in community is like the easiest way. Well, I don't know if it's the easiest, but it's the probably most like productive way to do that. So yeah, thank you for bringing that forward. And I think we're about to end the talk, but I love the time these things end with things like, what can allies do and what can like cis straight people do? And I kind of hate that bullshit. So I would rather think for us to think about like, actually, if we were for us to envision this idea of like a queer utopian future, what would that look like? What would queer people have? How would they live? All of these things. I think that's something that we don't spend enough time thinking about. So I would really love us to spend the next 10 minutes thinking about that. Evan, if you want to go first.
Yeah, I mean, just to say, Amardeep, yeah, you raised so many amazing points, and somebody's just said about the sustained disobedience. I love that. I love that, because that is the only way that we can keep doing the work, is if we figure out, really that, you said the infrastructure of care, infrastructures of care and support, the infrastructures that support the work, the frontline work to keep happening. And that's the piece that I just want to keep, because I feel like that's kind of where I come in. I've realized is being part of that. So I really appreciate you naming that alongside, alongside these other aspects. But in terms of the queer utopia, I just want to preface by saying that, it's. No, I don't want to be a downer about it. No, let's
Sure.
let's stay. No, I just want to, because I think I just want to, also say, as somebody that has done a lot of organizing in specifically, QTBPOC communities, it's like, yeah, until we do the sort of the healing and the work of kind of the sort of epigenetic inherited trauma, until we sort of really do that work, I think it's going to be really hard to get to the utopia, because like we can have a place that looks perfect, but like until we really understand and kind of I want to quote her name is escaping me now. It will come back to me now. It will come back to me. But essentially, she talks about, in relation to the, the sort of the abolition, I want to say project, but no, there's a lot of conversation around abolition at the moment, and she talks about, that first of all we've got to, abolish the police that's in our hearts, and it's like, for me, it's like just tending to that work, because actually I see so much hurt kind of enacted within our communities, in a really kind of, so I kind of, because it's like you can have this really perfect project, but then it can still just crumble, if we're not also doing that work to not kind of be constantly projecting and re-traumatizing each other. So as much as I have this vision, of land that we own, that we can tend to, where, because I think that's also part of this for me, is like also feeling like a sense of real ownership about the sites, the places in which we live, in order to then, build on. So yeah, thinking about, spaces, land that we can call our own, that we can build communities in, with that we can build communities together within, where we can be resourced. And I mean that materially, I mean that, mentally, spiritually, of course, as I mentioned, for me, it would there'd definitely be some water nearby. And fundamentally somewhere where, we can all feel a sense of safety, in our own bodies and in the environment that we're surrounded in. But yeah, fundamentally, I think the piece around like the healing work, for me comes first. Like that's when we can create the utopia. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like, this whole thing of, resources, obviously, necessary, but they need to be paired. yeah, as you said, with like collective and, you know, individual healing. And I really love what you said around like, you know, this idea like healing from trauma. And I think like we also need to heal from our own trauma of like, you know, however many years we've lived, and then we're also carrying all of this generational trauma. It's like that's not healing that can be done from one day to the other. So yeah, thank you.
Yes. Yeah, no, that's what I meant about the epigenetic piece, because actually it's also ancestral, you
Yeah,
know, this stuff. So it's so deep. It
it's
really is.
yeah. But I also love that you brought forward water as a fellow Cancer, and I can relate. I feel like I need water in my queer utopia.
Oh, and a great sound system, of course.
Yes.
So we can rave.
Yeah, rave by a lake. That's the dream. Yeah, Amardeep, do you want to share what your queer utopia looks like? And
Yeah, I think we're on the same page in many respects, right? I suppose that like my perspective on like what a queer utopia looks like is I am going to be the downer. Okay, that's what I'm going to do. So in a sense, like for me, like to think about a queer utopia is to think about like in some senses the abolition of what we might think of as like queerness, because it will not be kind of, it won't be against the kind of norm in that sense, because there won't be that norm policed in quite such a sense, right? And I guess in a more immediate way, well, so that would involve obviously the abolition of borders, the abolition of police, the abolition of prisons. It would involve constructions of communities and infrastructures of care. That would be part of queer utopia, and it would involve kind of access to land and access to water, but not necessarily what we now think of as ownership, right? But in terms of what a queer utopia means in practical senses, in a sense, I think the utility of the term queer, I think, right, is that it is counter to or at odds with, to a degree, like the kind of current structures. And there are going to be moves, and there have been moves in terms of like the legalization of gay marriage and stuff like that, towards kind of aligning queerness with that, right, with heteronormativity. So for me, I guess a queer utopia in some senses means retaining queerness as something useful, has to be reclaiming it not as an identity based on who you're attracted to necessarily, or the kind of things we might currently think about. Queerness has to be a political project that kind of affirms the fact that it's much memed now, but yeah, fuck it, I want to queer the state. And what does that mean? That means like non-reformist reforms that decentralize the state, right? I want to think about like queerness in that sense. Like, what does it mean to queer borders? Well, it means to make unenforceable legislation that would criminalize helping refugee seekers, for example, right? Like if we think about queerness as a political project and root it in that, I think that we can avoid the kind of representational politics that are coming at us. And a queer utopia, I guess, to finish, to me, just means sustained resistance against everything that is to come, in communities that hold each other accountable but are forgiving, and good sex also.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Can't forget that bit. Thank you.
Bob, if you're watching this, it's a lie.
Yeah, I think like, yeah, everything that you said was so fab. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think it's so, it's frustrating to see like queer people get comfortable with, you know, the system that we're under. And I think we see that a lot. And, you know, like recently there's been this whole thing of like, you know, non-binary people wanting their gender to be like legally recognized. And it's just like, you can't see how that's still like something that's hurtful to you. And I think it's actually quite sad to see, you know, it's quite sad to see people like, just like giving into the system like that when queerness could be so much more. So thank you for,
I mean, on like a similar note, like just, you know, people calling for like increased hate crime legislation in various senses. Like all of this stuff is predicated on like citizenship as a category, which is really exclusionary, which kind of like, you know, rooted in like European imperialism to a degree, right? And we just buy into it all the fucking time.
Yeah, I think that was like a conversation element of the event, and thank you both so much for everything that you raised. I feel like it's low-key, I feel like I've never really experienced in conversation event like this. So I feel really blessed to have been able to listen and take part, and it's been so special. And I rarely feel like optimistic, and I really feel slightly optimistic right now. So despite the fact that we're still quite downers in a lot of ways, I still feel optimistic. So I think that's quite special. Noni, do you want to close us off?
So that was just beautiful. That's the only thing I really have to add. But I just wanted to ask if anyone in the audience has a question that they'd like to ask the panel. Which just I also feel like, just to summarize everything that you basically said, June, this is like one of the best panels I've ever had the pleasure of witnessing, in that it's equal parts hopeful, equal parts realistic, because I feel like lots of the times when we talk about, I don't know, queer liberation, any form of liberation, I think people seek quite easy answers to our liberation. And it's just quite easy to be like, okay, if we all do mutual aid, everything would be great. But also, organizing with people is hard. People can be such bastards.
Yeah,
it's so difficult. And I feel like this conversation really captured all of those complexity of how, as marginalized people, can we actually organize together in ways that see each other clearly without being overly fairies and wonderland, because I love fairies, I love wonderlands, but there's a time and a place. And yeah, it's just, I'm really grateful to have been part of this chat. But we have a question in the chat. What is keeping you hopeful? From Ruhi Snyder. What's keeping you hopeful, everyone?
I can go first.
Go on.
I think probably what's keeping me hopeful is the sustained organizing that's happening in such horrific circumstances, and the space for collective joy that you can find still, and the will to fight. I think it's been it's been really incredible, at a time in which the government is using COVID restrictions to kind of push through authoritarianism, and people are naturally very scared and kind of buying into it, right? And buying into the idea of vaccine passports combined with harder borders, being kind of elided with the idea of the national good and safety. And at the same time, I've never heard so many people talking about abolition, not as a utopian idea, but as a practice, right? That gives me hope. The fact that so many people are turning up on a Thursday to a Zoom call about queer liberation, something that's not just something that you maybe wrote a dissertation on once, or used to chat up someone outside Dalston Superstore. It's actually these collective spaces are what give me hope and give me joy, and the kind of work that Evan and all of you guys are doing, that's what gives me joy.
Ooh, yeah, thank you. I mean, yeah, definitely echoing, what Armadeep said, and also, the fact that I think for me, being able to kind of turn and look and see younger folks, you folks on it and really making stuff happen, that's what makes me hopeful. As somebody that's kind of, in my 30s now, and actually seeing that actually there are folks that are still, that are energized and ready to do this work. That's how I know that, okay, we're on the right path, as hard as it still is, as much as we are still fighting, there are people that are taking the work on and are collectivizing the work that, as you say, and are also bringing joy into the work, because that is also so important, and that's also why, something like BOSS exists. It's how can we bring the joy into this work, into this organizing? So yeah, that keeps me hopeful.
What about you, June?
I think I echo what everyone's been saying. I think, the power of the collective and organizing, and as Evan said, the power of fun and partying and joy. That keeps me so hopeful. The fact that people can live in miserable conditions and still find that actually that's not fair saying miserable conditions, but conditions that where the state is trying to make us miserable, and it can actually fight that and can actually find joy. And I'm a big believer in the power of fun. So I think fun keeps me hopeful.
Beautiful.
What about you, Lee?
What keeps me hopeful? A good sound system. that has already been mentioned, and a good party and a good music. I feel like that's my best favorite thing about being queer, actually. It's just, we have fun. And yeah, I just love that. That's what keeps me hopeful. And also looking hot. That's just another thing. I just, I think it's great. Just the looks, even in just this call, the looks in one single call to do with economics, like, you won't get that anywhere else, I'm sorry. Next question is from Marcus. Marcus, go on. Give us a
Hi, hello everyone. You're great and beautiful. Thank you. I'm here with some lion people. Sam.
Hello.
I guess my question, it's not a question, it's like a statement, or it's like responding to queer utopia and some of the stuff that people talked about abolition. It's a bit of a Debbie Downer kind of situation, but just like, I think that, yeah, there's lots of stuff to be hopeful for, but we've also got like a lot of work to do on reparations, as in healing, as in reparative justice, which is what Lion we're trying to focus on. And so not just financial reparation, but like a way for our communities to heal. I think that there's, as we all know, there's a lot of trauma, and in my experience of being in many collectives with people here, we've experienced and witnessed a lot of like either like, us re-triggering each other, re-traumatizing each other, or people bringing trauma from, their lives into groups. And I just think like in all my years of organizing and being collective, the same things happen over and over again. And I feel like that we really need to work on that and focus on that healing, and how can we heal together. So I guess it's more of like a statement, or if people want to respond to that, but yeah.
I want to add,
and Sam wants to add
it's really amazing that this collective Decolonising Economics is crowdfunding for like a series of workshops on like building cooperative structures, which is exactly part of that healing work, because when we replicate hierarchical systems of white supremacy, that's when we end up replicating the same harm. So I don't know, I mean, like, they're really great, so you should definitely like
donate
fund and like, I just pass it on with people. But everyone's been great, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm just going to really quickly respond to that. That's really important, actually. And I think that there's a real problem, right? In that, like, I don't think that organizing groups on the left more broadly, but also within queer spaces where you're already questioning so much of what is normative and so much what is hierarchical and questioning the basis of it all, right? I don't think that most groups or most collectives or spaces have managed to kind of hold the importance of safeguarding, the importance of accountability, the purpose of accountability in a space. Like, there is like one thing that I see happening time and time again is stuff getting brushed under the carpet and hidden until it comes out, and then someone kind of a monster excluded from the space. There's not a recognition that exclusion from the space is about safeguarding and sometimes has to happen. But also, I do think a little bit some stuff has bled into what I would into the left, right? And this is this idea which is like, it's not my job to educate you, because it is not your job as a person of color or a queer person or a trans person to educate anyone else. If you are an organizer, if you are in the business of trying to change the world, fuck yes, it's your job. And it's not your personal job, it's our collective job, right? How are you going to hold someone accountable? How are you going to safeguard people? How are you going to build those spaces if we're not collectively doing that education work? And I think like co-op structures and stuff can be a really valuable like start to thinking about like, okay, without necessarily formalizing everything, what are the processes and procedures that we're doing to keep one another safe and to unlearn a lot of the harmful shit that we've all learned as well. But yeah, that's so important. I don't actually have an answer, but yeah.
I think, what you said, I really feel, on a deep level. And I think it's, I feel like there's a few like catchphrases that you kind of find like in organizing in the left. And I feel like some of them are quite dangerous. And I think that could be one of them. And I think there's also this whole thing, since we're talking about money, I think there's this whole thing about like, oh, people deserve to be paid for their labor, which is like absolutely true. And like we do live under capitalism and people need to have money. But I think I also want us to move to a point where we, try and explore different currencies in certain spaces, in certain collectives that are not money. And like what, emotions as currency and like care as currency, things like, I want us to like explore alternatives that aren't just money. And that's something I'm like quite keen to do. And I think that goes hand in hand with healing as well. Yeah.
I can jump in as well. I think one of those other really dangerous things that I think are being said quite a lot in our like communities is like ancestors, and people just brandish ancestor stuff all over, like without actually thinking about what is ancestral veneration. And ancestral veneration is that healing work, right? Is those like recognition of like the conflicting feelings that we have inside that are also built under like capitalism and like exploitation culture. And I'm really like, yeah, and I'm really been thinking a lot about like ancestral learning, right? So like, you know, with understanding that my grandmother like worked and like broke her back for so many years, right? And like how then that filters down generationally through me. And like when I think about healing, I think about healing my grandmother's connection to work and labor and how that is also manifested through me. And like, you know, the weird feelings I have. I was sick last week and I had a lot of issues about not going to work, and I was so angry and I was so upset, and then I was like, why am I crying over labor? You know, stuff like that. So I've been really like, yeah, I think about like ancestral veneration as like ways in which it's linked to like capitalism, like dismantling capitalism, as opposed to kind of legitimizing really harmful, misogynistic, exploitative, like really harmful ideas that kind of show up. And also that is an issue of economic justice, because a lot of our grandparents were like exploited to such an extent, and you know, that is things that are within our family lines as well. And like also when people talk about ancestral stuff, sometimes it can be a bit wanky, and I'm really interested in ways in which is actually like, you know, not this, you know, like that whole like woman, you know, like, you know, like I'm just in a field, I don't know, stuff like that. It's great, but it's not for me. So that's what I always think about in terms of like healing as well. But Evan, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, no, what you're saying really, really resonates for me deeply, you know, and that kind of sort of took further the epigenetic piece, you know, that I was mentioning. But, you know, I guess just to complicate that, you know, a little bit, you know, I think people's access to their lineage is really varied as well. You know, not everybody can even tap into that awareness and that understanding. So, you know, I'm really for that particular work, like when you have those direct, when you're very aware of like what is present. But, you know, I also think there is benefits to just calling on benevolent, so specifically benevolent ancestral energy into the work that you're doing. You know, so even when you can't necessarily explicitly name, you know, there's still energies that can be tapped into and that can be drawn from. It's just, you know, you have to be mindful about connecting with loving ancestors, because, you know, also, you know, even though, you know, we're in the position that we are in now in this body, it's like we don't know who else we've been in other lifetimes. I don't necessarily want to get too into that, because that can get really, really messy. But I think we also have to understand that we also have, you know, people in our lineage who maybe weren't you know, the most right on people. So also just being really mindful, you know, when we are working with ancestral energy, to like connect with those who can be really supportive in the work, you know, because I know yeah, for me, there's been a lot of questions around like how and why I've ended up here in, you know, in this particular situation and this particular configuration. But actually to draw on ancestral energy makes me what am I trying to get at? You know, just as somebody that hasn't necessarily had a lot of support from my living family in my lifetime, to actually draw on ancestral energy has been really beneficial in terms of like moving towards an abundant mindset, because I know that it does exist within my lineage. It's just not immediately apparent, you know, and so kind of learning to understand, you know, the subtle communications that can come from ancestral energy has been really important to me. I mean, again, this is possibly a different conversation, like learning to kind of understand understand the nuance of ancestral communication, but it's something I'm really up for talking about with, with folks that do, because it is something I do quite a lot of work around. Yeah. And yeah, it was Tourmaline that I mentioned before. I saw somebody put her name in the chat, so I'll just say that.
Just to very quickly come in on that, because we're at the time as well, but yeah, I find that really interesting. And to slightly complicate it a bit more as well, like, I think, like, for me, when I think about like ancestry, I'm always very aware that, like, my ancestors, in many senses, they were fighters, and they tilled the land, but they were also people who were complicit in patriarchy. There were also people who were complicit in the caste system and caste supremacy. There were also people who experienced violence and perpetrated violence. So I think it's really interesting when we talk about that stuff, and really important, I think, not to try and fetishize or connect to the structures through which certain things were expressed socially. But maybe to try and connect to something deeper. But someone put in the chat a question about queer children, right? And I find that really, really difficult as a subject, not just because of personal experiences that we all have, #trauma, but also just because, I think what it means to be a queer child is really, in many ways, contested, right? I mean, like, on one level, like, I knew since the age of 8, right? I felt something that I now realize was queerness from the age of 8, or maybe even earlier. But kind of identifying with that label is also something that, like, people will change, and we can argue that questioning, that changing necessarily involves them in, like, queerness. But I think it's hard because on one level, by trying to provide the space in the community for that, we can only do that at a local level, right? You can only do it within your own family or your own street or the people who you know and are around you. You can create those spaces for conversations. You can do that. You have to do that educational work with families. You have to kind of make those interventions in the personal lives of the people around you. But as a more abstracted queer community, if we're thinking about, trying to get past the imaginative limits that capitalism has placed on us and that the nuclear family has placed on us, right? Like, what we're thinking of in terms of structures, even within like a queer context, is inhibited by that. And I'm always a little bit wary of necessarily saying, hey, this is where you neatly slot in, this is the role that we neatly play, because I think it can kind of play in a little bit to the limiting of those imaginative potentials. That's not to say, of course, that like it's not vitally important for there to be space for queer kids and opportunities for healing. I guess, like, from my perspective, I'm just so conscious that trauma is ongoing all the time, that maybe some of the best things that you can do is attack the more legible forms of violence and oppression that we see around that. So, for example, like in terms of class oppression, in terms of oppression on the basis of migration status, in terms of like the intervention of the carceral state, and in some cases social workers, and all of that stuff, right? We can try to create communities that are kind of self-sustaining a bit more, and that gives us the power to create those spaces in which children can be queer and they can heal, or hopefully one day maybe they will not undergo the same traumas that we went through. I don't know, but it's an important question.
Would anyone else like to add to that question, or should we close up?
I mean, I think one quick thing that I would say is, like, as someone who, doesn't really deal with kids in their daily lives much, so I feel like I don't have the expertise, but I also feel like there's something about, like, the same way I think self-determination and autonomy is like a massive thing for adults. And I think, that's why I feel like trans healthcare is so important, is because, like, trans people deserve to have autonomy over their body, and they deserve to, like, determine their own identity and however they want to. To me, that applies to, like, kids as well to a degree. And, I don't think, like, infantilizing kids and, like, making decisions on their behalf is necessarily, like, the way to go. And so I think, yeah, when I think about, like, queer kids and healing, to me, that's, like, something that I would encourage, is like self-determination and kind of like ownership over their decision.
Thank you. So I just feel like that was just a whirlwind of amazingness, of information, of great knowledge. And also, like, I feel like we we talked about this whole subject from so many different angles, and that's on Queerness, just to say that as well. And I'm just so grateful for the speakers today, and like, yeah, just showing up and just taking us on a literal journey through queerness and the universe and history and the future. It was amazing. And I would, yeah, so we're going to start closing up. I think maybe one thing that we should do is just a round of applause for just the speakers, and also June for great co-hosting as well. So you can unmute yourself and then just clap.
Yeah, honestly, it was so good. I learned so much.
That was amazing.
Thank you, everybody, very much.
And thanks for organizing. Like, yeah, it was really good.
Thank you. I felt like that's the closest you'll ever get to a live audience on Zoom. I felt like I was in an actual live audience. Thank you so much. And also thank you to all of you that came as well, and for also supporting our crowdfunder as well. Actually, quick thing just to plug the crowdfunder. So this is our last event on the Decolonising Futures program. We've heard through so many amazing speakers, through the entire series. We've heard from the great duo Kim and Jumoke, who did our disability justice event. We heard from Esther, from Yvonne from Moore, who were talking about reparations. We heard from Penny from the Racial Justice Network. I can't even remember all of them because it's just been so good. And I would also like to just thank Ola and Sophie for all their support and help in like making sure that this happens. And if you don't know, Decolonising Economics, like 80% of the time it's just me and Guppi, and yeah, me and Guppi. And once in a while we'll like reach out to our collective of like June, Ola, and Sophie, and these people always show up and help us in really amazing ways. So I just really like to say thank you for that. If you haven't, please donate to our crowdfunder. And our crowdfunder is fundraising so that we take a couple of BAC and POC cooperatives through a project of like learning about cooperatives and setting up their own cooperatives. And it's really exciting because some people in the movement are also going to be part of it as well. Wink wink to Black Unicorn and to Rad, I can't remember the full name, but to Rad, to Lion, and so many great groups that we get to work with as well. And upcoming things, I don't know what me and Guppi have planned. We kind of make stuff up as we go because, you know, grassroots. But a main thing is that we're fundraising, so please share and support. And also, I'm going to pass on to speakers. Do you have anything that you'd like to plug, or ways that people can keep up to date with your work or anything that's coming up?
I just want to plug, well, there's a couple of things I want to plug, sorry. Doing lots of things as everyone here is because we're on the left. I'd like to plug Red Pepper, which I'm a co-editor at. It's a socialist magazine. It's not cranky, which is quite rare. It's been going for like 30 years, and it's just the most incredible space to work at. It's very chaotic, and like most left publications, like we don't have all that much cash, but it's probably the most internationalist publication out there on the left. So if you can, there's a pay-as-you-feel subscription. So just for a couple of quid, you can support my heating bill if you fancy it. Also, if you've enjoyed the conversations here, I'm program coordinator at the World Transformed. So we'll be running a festival in Brighton at the end of September. Tickets are going to be released soon. So go to TWT Now's Twitter account to watch that space. And then I'll see you all there in person. And then, yeah, if you want to follow more of my journalism work, I think my Twitter handles are linked, so I'm not going to do that. Oh, if you know any bartenders in South London, or just fuck it in London, that want help or support at work or in organising or with their union, tell them to get in touch with South London Bartenders Network. And if you know any bartenders across the country that want to set up their own network of autonomous organising, get in touch. We're happy to share a template and we're happy to chat. And yeah, also kill the bill.
Ooh, yes. I mean, yeah, my handles have already been shared. I mean, nothing's coming to mind for me at the moment. I mean, support, you know, Boss and yeah, Black Obsidian's work. There may be some parties in the not too distant future. Let's see. Yeah, nothing's coming to mind for me. Just donate to the Decolonising Economics fundraiser. Yes.
Yeah, I'm not going to plug anything, but I want to thank you, Noni, for being the best person ever and yeah, changing the world. You're amazing.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, everyone. We'll hope to see you soon. And thanks. Hope have a great day. Enjoy your life. Farewell. Bye.